After the development of the seed, the next development was the development of flowers. This was a very big advancement. It allowed the plants to really specialize the type of pollinator that they were going to use. So once we had the flowers evolve, we became more dependent on insect and animal pollination and got away from a lot of the wind pollination that was taking place with the gymnosperms. So the angiosperms is really kind of a generic term. The phylum that we're talking about is Anthophyta. So all of the flowering plants do fall into that one single phylum. When we're talking about the flower, this is a structure that's really specialized for sexual reproduction. So it's specialized for sexual reproduction and it's specialized for pollination. Flowers will be very unique according to what pollinator is actually bringing the pollen to the ovule. Now, if we look at this flower here, a flower consists of modified leaves. We tend to have 4 different sets of modified leaves, and we're going to go through and point out each one of them here. The very first one, the outermost one, is what we call the sepals. The sepals tend to look like leaves, small leaves. They rest right underneath the flower itself, and they tend to be green. So these tend to do some photosynthesis. They tend to support and protect the flower somewhat. The next whorl is going to be our petals. The petals are usually brightly colored. They are usually fairly flimsy, but brightly colored, and their main purpose is to attract the pollinator. So if we're looking at a hummingbird pollinator, then they tend to be red because hummingbirds like red. So they really are a close match between the pollinator for that particular plant. The petals and the sepals are the 2 modified leaves that don't really have anything themselves to do with the production of the egg or the sperm. They are really there to attract pollinators. If we start to look at the structures that are involved in the production of egg and sperm, the first part we want to look at is the male structure. So this is what's going to lead to the production of pollen. So this whole structure right here is what we call the stamen. And the stamen, if we talk about parts of it, it has a stalk and then it has a structure at the top. The stalk is what we call the filament. And what the filament is going to do is it's going to raise that up in the air. So the pollen will be higher in the air, which means it's more likely to come into contact with the pollinator. And then at the very top, this is what we call the anther. And the anther is where you would have the actual pollen produced. So the pollen will be on the anther and the filament will make sure that it's raised high in the air. The female part is this right here. And all of this is what we call the carpel. The carpel has at the very tip of it what we call the stigma. The stigma is going to be sticky. This is going to enable any pollen that comes into contact with it to really stick so that it has the opportunity to grow down and come into contact with the ovule. In the middle here, we have what's called the style. This is going to both raise the stigma up in the air, and it's also going to provide the tunnel that that pollen tube is going to grow down through. In the very bottom of it, we have what's called the ovary. And within the ovary, you can have 1 or more ovules. So in this example here, we're seeing 6 different ovules. So each one of these would be an ovule itself. So it is very possible for a flower to have multiple ovules inside of it. If the ovules do get fertilized, then they are going to develop into a seed. Another major advancement that we had in angiosperms is the fruit. So while the flower was very important for getting pollination to take place, the fruit is really specialized for seed dispersal. So this is for seed dispersal. And when we're talking about the fruit is a mature ovary. And that ovary is going to basically thicken. And when it thickens, it's going to encase the seeds inside of it. So if you think about the fruits that you have this tissue on the outside, and then you have the seed buried in the middle. We can have both fleshy fruits and we can also have dry fruits. If we look at just where the fruit comes from, we talked about the structure of the flower already, and we say that the seed is in the ovule, and then the ovary is what's going to develop into the fruit. So if you focus on the orange in these pictures, we see the ovary in the very first one, and it's very small. But after we have fertilization take place, then we start to see that get enlarged, and it's going to thicken until we have the actual fruit itself. So this is a persimmon fruit here. This would be considered a fleshy fruit. Other fruits that are fleshy would be things like tomatoes and plums and cherries, those types of things. If we're talking about those fruits, a lot of times they are fleshy fruits that have a sweet taste to them or some type of taste that's going to be attractive to an animal of some sort. So whether that is a bird or whether it happens to be a squirrel or something else, the idea here is that they can come and they can consume those, and that will help to disperse the seeds. The fruit isn't really going to help us at all with pollination because at this point pollination has already taken place. The fruit really only develops well if we do have fertilization. If we look at examples of what we call dry seeds or dry fruits, these, a lot of them are modified for wind dispersal. So these have a structure that might pop open and then allow the seeds to just kind of blow out over time. Okay, so the fruit itself is going to be adapted for seed dispersal. That is the goal of the fruit, is to help that seed get far away from the parent plant. If we look at more wind pollinated ones, it may not look like what we typically think of as a fruit, but all of this kind of fuzzy stuff that's on here, that is the fruit. The fruit doesn't have to be some fleshy, good tasting tissue. It just has to develop from the ovary wall. So if it develops from the ovary wall, we do call it a fruit, even though there may not be any animals or insects or anything that's actually interested in consuming that. So here we have two examples of ones that would disperse by wind. The maple on the bottom has wings on it that kind of act like propellers when the wind blows. So that helps to carry those a long distance as well. We can also have ones that are specialized for animals to disperse them. You could have animals attracted to eating them, like we see the bird on the bottom of this slide. So the bird would consume that seed, the fleshy tissue would break down and be consumed, and then the seed itself has a tough outer coating on it so that it would pass through the digestive tract just fine. So the embryo inside is still going to very much be viable once that seed does get dispersed elsewhere. You could also have seeds specialized for animal dispersal that are really meant just to hitchhike or attach to the animal. You've probably all seen or been familiar with the seeds that you see on the top here. These will hook onto animal fur or hook onto clothing, and then they would be brushed off or fall off somewhere quite far from the original place that they were picked up. So the fruit is going to help get that seed far away from the parent plant. If we take a look at the life cycle of the angiosperm, it's similar in a lot of ways to what we had with the conifers. In this case, we don't have cones anymore. We've got the flower structure instead, and we've got the microsporangium developing on the anther, and we have the megasporangium developing inside the ovary, which is part of the carpel. The microspores, they will develop into the pollen grain. The pollen grains can be wind dispersed. They could be dispersed by pollinators as well, so animals and insects. And they may be carried to a different plant altogether. They may be carried to the same flower. So they may just be transferred from the anther onto the stigma of the same flower. Depends on the plant, really. If we look at the ovules are going to produce the megasporangium, which will develop into the egg. If we have pollination take place, the pollen grain is going to land on the stigma. It's going to grow a tube down the style, And then those nuclei that are inside are going to come into contact with the ovule, and we will get fertilization between the sperm and the egg. That then leads to the zygote. The zygote's diploid tissue, it would divide by mitosis to grow into the embryo. Now, at the same time, one thing that is important here is that we're going to get what's called double fertilization. This double fertilization has to do with the fact that you've got two nuclei or two sperm inside that pollen tube. One of them will fuse with the egg and we get the zygote. The other pollen will fuse with what is already diploid tissue, and this is going to develop into the endosperm. The endosperm is the food source. So that is the source of food for that developing embryo inside the egg. Then if we do have the ovary wall develop and thicken, we would have fruit produced. So altogether, what double fertilization is going to do is it's going to synchronize the production of the food source with the actual fertilization process. This way, the plant is not going to put extra effort into producing a food source unless there is a viable embryo there that will be feeding off of that food source. Then if we get that seed dispersed and it lands in a good environment for germination, then it would germinate and we would get that sporophyte tissue again. If we go back to our phylogenetic tree, angiosperms are thought to have evolved probably about 140 million years ago. After that, it's really hard to follow exactly how they all fit together. It's not really thought to be necessarily a monophyletic group. We do have several different branches inside that we're going to take a look at. It used to be thought that there were two main distinctions. We had monocots and we had dicots. And all plants, flowering plants, used to be divided into these two groups. Well, the monocots has really held together, but the dicots has been split up. So within the dicot group, we now have what we call eudicots, which means true dicots. And then we also have what we call basal angiosperms. And then we have the magnolids. So let's take a look at these. The basal angiosperms are really, they seem to be the oldest lineages of flowering plants. There's not a whole lot of representative members, but we do have Ambarella, which a lot of study has gone into that plant to try to figure out some of the history of flowering plants and their origins. And this group is also going to include water lilies. So we see a couple examples of those down at the bottom. Those are the basal angiosperms. If we look at the magnolids, the magnolids are quite ancient plants as well. And these don't have as fancy of flowers as what you'll see in the angiosperms and the monocots. These tend to have a spiral arrangement to their floral organs. And this is as opposed to a whorled arrangement when we get to the monocots and the dicots. So both of the magnolids and also the basal angiosperms will have this spiral arrangement to the floral organs. From the name, we do have magnolias in this group. And we also have laurels, which you're seeing down here at the bottom. There's not a whole lot of plants that fall into this magnolids category.